Today I'm going to once again dispel the myth that merely spending fewer than 183 days in a country means you won't owe them taxes. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson. This is Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best. And when you are a high earner, when you are a high net worth or ultra high net worth individual, you need to be especially concerned about where you may be getting yourself into tax trouble. And for a lot of people who are becoming nomads for the first time, who are going and living overseas, becoming tax non-resident of their country, even giving up their citizenship, there's a lot of new concepts that they need to be aware of. If you've lived in, let's say, the United States or Australia or Germany your entire life, you've taken vacations, maybe you've even gone and lived somewhere else long-term without any kind of real concern for where you were paying taxes, because you knew where you were paying taxes, you were paying them at home. But when you decide to cut your tax ties and go overseas, you really need to be aware. And so I got a question from someone that asked, Shakira spent fewer than 183 days in Spain, and yet the Spanish government is asking her for taxes. Can you comment on this? Now, I don't want to comment on Shakira specifically because I'm not familiar with all the aspects of the case, but what I do want to say, and in full disclaimer, we're going to be using some layman's terms, we're going to be using some generalizations in this episode because this could apply to many different situations, and so we're not going to get into any one particular scenario. But I am going to tell you that when people say just spend under 6 months, they are often getting themselves into trouble. We've talked about this for years. Now, there are still some countries in the world that have what we informally call around the office kind of a strict days test, where there's more or less one test in which you can become a taxpayer, and it's what's called a days test. Did you spend 183 days, or it might be 180 in some countries, or whatever else. The United States has a version of this called the substantial presence test, and it's a little bit more complicated, but if you look at that, depending on your situation, that's going to be a good guidepost for whether you're a U.S. taxpayer. How much time have you spent in the U.S. over the course of a 3-year period? You look at other countries like, let's say, Colombia, for example, where you've relatively got a strict test. You spend 183 or you don't. But what you've got in many other countries is you've got multiple tests where they not only look at the time that you spend there, but they'll look at, in some cases, the totality of your business and social relationships. They'll look at where your finances are. They'll look at your connections to the country. If you've claimed you left the country, is it your intention to come back? Do you own property in the country? Do you have available accommodation to you? Does your spouse and child live in the country? I mean, there's many different tests that'll come. They'll look at things like what's called a center of life test. And so there's many different names for this. But the idea is, hey, listen, we're going to make sure that just because you spend 1 day less than half the year or something like that, that you're not off the hook. And I remember a story of a friend of mine, this is a couple of years ago, and he was having a great time. I think he was in Germany. And he had just bought a car, and he was debating buying an apartment, or maybe it was the other way around. But either way, I was talking to one of the German tax advisors that we've worked with. And the idea was, even though this guy was only spending like maybe 4 months in the country, he was building a real profile as if like, hey, Germany, that's your home. And so, depending on the country where you're spending time, you really need a plan for, is this country going to come after me? Because what I can tell you is, you'll leave a country of the caliber of a Germany, of that level of sophistication where they really want their money. And let's say you spend 4 months at home and you think, hey, I'm well under the 6 month, the halfway mark in the year. But let's say you travel around a lot. Okay, well, where else are you paying taxes? Where else is your home? Do you have a tax residence? Do you have a more substantial home? I mean, these are the kinds of questions. And again, we're not talking about Germany in particular. This is not tax advice for any particular situation. But these are the kinds of things that many countries are going to ask. And so if you are leaving a high tax country, many of them are going to want to know indeed, either where did you move to, or where are you paying taxes now? And if you don't provide that to their satisfaction, then they may continue to tax you, or when you come back, they may, ask to have taxed you. And so you can certainly, split your time between different countries. But I'll tell you, if you want to split your time between, let's say, Spain and Germany and the United States, you're going to be threading the needle quite a bit because these are all countries that have certain criteria. And so the question is going to be, well, which one is your most substantial country? Something that I think is very important for people to have is to have some kind of tax home, a tax residence, that if you either give up U.S. citizenship and therefore you no longer have a tax home in the United States, at least by default, or you leave your country, you decide, hey, Australia, hey, Germany, hey, wherever, I'm moving out, I'm packing my stuff and I'm going. Having a place where you pay tax is going to be very important for not only tax authorities, but also getting by in life, things like banking, brokerage accounts, stuff like that. They're going to ask you, where do you pay tax? Now, there are certainly some tax residences where you can just, spend less than 6 months there if you're living nomadically. There are tax residences designed specifically for that. For example, in Anguilla, it's one of the more expensive versions of that. You can do that. And that list of kind of what we might call a paper tax residence, those are shrinking. And they're becoming more difficult. But there are certainly some where you can go and you can establish a connection, and as long as you don't spend, more than 6 months in any one country, they can do that. But the idea of threading the needle going between lots of high tax jurisdictions is going to be difficult. And Spain and Germany and Canada or whatever the mix is are not really going to accept, well, hey, but we didn't spend 183 days in any of them. They're going to want to know, like, hey, which of us are you paying by and large? And those just are example countries. Now, if you were to fully check out of your, tax home that you're in now, and you were to go to, let's say, Mexico and Colombia and spend, 5 months in each of those, and then commit 1 or 2 months to a tax residence that doesn't require a full 6 months, that could much more easily work. But the issue is that, if you're going to leave a high tax country, and become what's called tax non-resident, you're going to determine when you leave how much time you're allowed to come back. It might be a lesser amount of time for the first year. It might only be a month or so in the first year, or a matter of weeks, and that's going to build back up over time once you're out. But in the long run, you may be able to spend 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, whatever. I mean, some countries, perhaps you could push close to that 6 months, but that's really not that many countries where people are probably watching. And so the answer very simply is countries want to know, where is your life taking place? Where is the totality of your life? And I think a lot of people don't adequately go through the steps to remove their life from the high tax country they're moving out of to where they potentially never exit the tax system, and or they put themselves back in it on a continuous basis by thinking that, hey, anything less than 183 days is going to get me in. That's simply not the case in the era of multiple different tests that can apply to you. So every country is different. There are still some countries that are pretty cut and dry. Probably not a lot of people from those countries who are watching this. Now, you could go to those countries and you could certainly live nomadically that way, where, hey, again, I live in 2 places and then I have my proper tax residence in the middle. But you're going to want to get tax advice for all the jurisdictions where you're spending substantial time in or where you have connections to. Again, the countries where we talk about buying property, for example, in order to get residence and citizenship, are generally going to be more flexible, right? I mean, if you go and buy a property in Turkey and become a Turkish citizen, they're not going to look at that as your center of life unless you decide to move into the property for a substantial part of time. But if you've been a taxpayer there before, the stakes are probably going to be higher. And so the answer quite simply is, be aware where you're leaving, be aware where you're settling in, and understand how difficult their criteria are going to be. Some of the more emerging countries that we've talked about are more flexible in terms of their tax rules, to where they're not going to try and snare you in to their clutches after spending only 3 or 4 months there. And so that makes it more flexible to live in, let's say, a Montenegro. I don't think after 3.5 months Montenegro is going to bother you. That's just my personal opinion. Don't take that as tax advice. But if you, again, spend time in a country where you've allegedly left, or if you're spending time in some of the European countries and you're starting to establish some ties and you open a bank account and your girlfriend's from there and whatever else, then it's probably going to be more likely to be looked at. And so that is an example of how someone can spend fewer than the days test count in a country and potentially be asked to pay tax. And that's why it's so important to have advanced advice documented in writing, before you decide to go and spend time in many of these countries. Don't stop now. We've got well over 1,000 more videos here on YouTube for you to watch and learn how to go where you're treated best. And if you want to work with Nomad Capitalist personally, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply, learn about our unique, tried and true process, garnered over years of experience, and learn how you can become our client.